Greetings, folks, and welcome to the Introduction to the Watchmen. I hope you're enjoying the book so far. To be honest, it's one of my very favorite novels of all time, graphic or otherwise, so it's always very exciting when I get to teach it. By way of introduction, I thought I would delve a little bit into the history of the comic book genre itself. I know many of you are familiar with this, but I assume that at least a few of you are not. And interestingly, we'll find as we go through the narrative of Watchmen itself, it dramatizes the history, the publishing history of the genre in some really interesting ways. So once we have certain details of time and date and character laid out in fairly straightforward order, it's not actually that difficult to place the narrative of Watchmen into that history. As probably all of you know, the two main publishers in the comic book industry are DC and Marvel. So a little bit about those. DC was originally named National Allied Publications in 1934 and changed its name to Detective Comics in 1939. It was bought by Warner Brothers in 1969 and subsequently bought by Disney in 2018. Marvel, on the other hand, was originally called Timely Publications, and they began operations in 1939. In 1950, they changed their name to Atlas Comics, and in 1961 to Marvel Comics. They were bought by Disney in 2009. So at the moment, and for the foreseeable future, Disney has a monopoly on mainstream comic book culture. But that's not why I'm giving this lecture. What I want to do instead is lay out the ages of the comic book industry from its beginning up into the present. There are 4.5 ages that we need to address. And taking the model of Hesiod, I suppose, these ages are labeled as follows. There is the Golden Age, which ran from 1938 to 1949. There's a period called the Interregnum from 1950 to 1955. The Silver Age ran from 1956 to 1970. The Bronze Age began in 1970 and ran to 1985. And then the Modern Age, which is the age we are currently in, began in 1985. So, what do all of these mean? Well, the Golden Age begins with the first publication of Superman in Action Comics in 1938 by DC. So we'll run through the major heroes of the Golden Age. These are, of course, Superman, DC, 1938, Batman, DC, 1939, and in 1940, we see DC putting out Wonder Woman, the first female superhero, The Flash, Green Lantern, and the first teen comic, the Justice Society of America. We also see Fawcett Comics putting out Captain Marvel, or Shazam, which became licensed to DC in 1972. And there are also comic book versions of The Shadow, Doc Savage, and Green Hornet. All of these are, of course, radio drama characters. In 1941, Marvel releases Captain America, and DC puts out Plastic Man. So these are the major heroes of the Golden Age. So why is it called the Golden Age? Well, I suppose something has to be. The Golden Age heroes, by the way, were very different from subsequent heroes. Everybody's familiar, pretty much, with Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. Now, they've changed a lot, but these characters are still the same characters in at least a fundamental way to who they were when they first came into publication. But the characters, for example, Flash, Green Lantern, these are completely different now, and we'll get into that a little later. The Golden Age comics were sometimes quite violent. Many of them, of course, took up Second World War narratives it being an American publication in 1941. The format was slightly larger than the current format of comic books. And these were actually quite successful as publishing endeavors. They were wildly popular. The storylines were often very simplistic, the colors largely primary colors. And the appeal, I suppose, and I've always loved superhero comics, I grew up on them, was to individual potency, to a sense of both power and justice, and to a deep sense, I think, of something that we might actually call cultural righteousness. By the end of the 1940s, though, the superhero comic industry, or the superhero comic boom, had ended. The heroes who appealed to people during the war years and in the years immediately following the war years largely stopped appealing to people by the beginning of the 1950s. And by 1950, the only superheroes whose titles were still in publication were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. All of the other hero comics had dropped out of publication. So Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman have always been in publication, and they are the only three. In 1950, we enter the Interregnum. Now, the Interregnum is the period, of course, between the Golden and Silver Ages, and this runs from 1950, of course, to 1955, which not just incidentally lines up with the early years of the Cold War. The things that people were concerned with, the things that frightened people, had changed. In the early 1940s, they were afraid of Nazis, for example. Well, by the early 1950s, they were afraid of global nuclear destruction. And the type of comic that appealed to the comic reading and comic buying public had changed. This is the age of the horror comic. In 1950, the first horror comic, Crypt of Terror, comes into publication. This later became Tales from the Crypt. 1952 sees the publication of Sergeant Rocky, who later becomes Sergeant Rock. That is, there's also a lot of war comics going on at this time. And in fact, another very popular comic that began publication in this year was called Atomic War. And the reason I said Atomic War was that the title had an exclamation point. The horror comics tended to be, and many of the war comics as well, very violent, sometimes graphically violent, in ways that upset a lot of the parents of the comic buying public, among other things, and certainly a number of politicians, as you can imagine. So in 1954, following a documentary called Seduction of the Innocent, which attempts to blame rises in juvenile delinquency on comics, we have the beginning of an anti-comic book movement. Now, okay, I'm going to pause on this one because we've all been through some version of this bullshit at some point. In 1954, it was comic books that were causing juvenile delinquency. It's also, since then, it's been rock and roll music, it's been heavy metal music, it's been hip hop, it's been well, I remember when in the early 1980s, I was one of the people who established the Dungeons and Dragons Club in my high school. Yes, I'm that geek. And there was a local nun, Sister Mary something or other, who was bound and determined that she was going to prevent us from establishing our club because she was convinced, as many were at the time, that Dungeons and Dragons was from the devil. It was satanic, and we were engaging in satanic things. So, okay, fine. We've all been through this shit. People are scared, and people are always looking to blame things that go wrong on things that they don't understand, things that are part of their visceral fears and superstitions. In any case, this became a political issue. And in 1954, the U.S. Senate set up a subcommittee on juvenile delinquency. And it focused largely on crime and horror comic book titles. This was a bipartisan committee. It consisted of 12 people, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and had a rotating chair in which a Democrat and a Republican would take turns. So this is back in the days before 1994, when genuine bipartisan politics was possible in the United States. As a result of these hearings, the comic book industry, the comic book publishers got together and established something called the Comics Code Authority. I will post, or by the time you get this, maybe we'll have already posted, the original Comics Code Authority standards. These are quite draconian, and these are what basically save the comic book industry from going out of business, but it comes at a cost. Horror comic book publishing pretty much comes to an end. Same with crime and most of the war comics. They go out of print. But what happens is in 1956, as a result of the comic books code, superhero comics start coming back, but they're really cleaned up. There are certain rules that this comics code authority, which existed for several decades, demanded that publishers follow. Just a few examples. One, crime can never be seen to be of benefit. So basically, the moral has to always be crime does not pay. Another example is that figures of authority, police, for example, or political authority, can never be presented in a bad light. They must always be good. Anything other than heterosexual sex is completely off limits. Violence should be kept to a minimum. Basically, this is the age of 1950s conformity. This is the comic books version of the world that the McCarthy-era hearings wanted to produce. Communism, of course, was bad. All of the titles had to come around, all of the storylines had to come around to supporting the ideological agenda of American society. So that's the Interregnum and the beginning of the Silver Age. Now, as I said, the Silver Age ran from 1956 to 1970. Then the Silver Age is the time when the Comics Code Authority had the greatest influence. So here are a few things that happen. In 1956, DC revives The Flash. This is the first Silver Age comic. And the trend for reviving superhero comics begins pretty much there. Now, of course, most of us know the Flash, if we know him at all, as Barry Allen. Barry Allen is the Silver Age Flash. The Golden Age Flash was Jay Garrick, and he looked very different. And the same is true of the other former Golden Age heroes who were revived in or revised in the Silver Age. They acquired different identities. They're actually completely different people. Whereas the original three, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, they keep their same identities. They're the same people. That's why I said, even though they've gone through many changes, there's a consistency to them that no other superhero characters have. In 1960, DC puts out the Justice League of America, so they're reviving the team comic, and this is the year in which they also re-release Green Lantern as Hal Jordan. 1961 is a big year for Marvel. They release, and these are all attributed to Stan Lee, the great Stan Lee. He is very much a cultural icon and one of the more culturally influential people, I would say, of the latter half of the 20th century in North American culture. We see the Fantastic Four, Hulk, and Thor. And then in 1963, and these are all also Stan Lee titles, Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Avengers, and the X-Men. The guy was productive. In 1966, Marvel puts out Black Panther, the first non-white superhero. Now, I'd like to pause on this for a second. The first superhero comic was published in 1938. This, of course, the character is Superman, as we talked about before. And by 1940, we have Wonder Woman. That took 2 years to go from having a male superhero to having a female superhero. And yet it took 28 years to go from having a white superhero to a black superhero. And Black Panther is not American. If you want the first African-American superhero, also put out by Marvel, by the way, that is Falcon, and he came out in 1969, so 31 years after the first publication of a superhero set in the United States, we have a black superhero finally doing his thing in the United States. These two, Black Panther and Falcon, are of course coming out of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. And the time it took to get from an all-white cast to the beginning of any kind of racial mixing among superheroes, says a lot about the business model and the social understandings of the country, largely the United States, mostly the United States, for whom this industry, or at whom this industry was aimed. This brings us around to the Bronze Age, which, as I said, ran from 1970 to 1985. So we're getting close to where we actually want to be for the book we're talking about. These tended to involve darker storylines. This is where social issues like drugs, alcohol, environmental pollution start coming up. In an issue of Green Lantern, Green Arrow, for example, and I think this was 1971 or 72. No, I think it was 1970, actually. Green Arrow's sidekick, Speedy, Roy Harper, becomes addicted to heroin, and there's a two-issue series that deals with his heroin addiction. This series, this two-book series, did not bear the stamp of the Comics Code Authority. And from here on in, we start seeing more and more challenges. And the Comics Code Authority is revised a couple of times to try to accommodate this. But from the early 1970s on, the Comics Code Authority is largely in retreat. In the early 70s as well, there is briefly a turn away from superhero comics. I'm not entirely sure why, but the trend did reverse in the mid-1970s. One of the things that's notable, though, is that with the reversal of the trend, the sort of comeback of superhero comics in the mid-70s, there's an increase in the number of non-white heroes. So the culture of the superhero community is becoming more and more mixed. This also is a time when we start seeing crossovers between Marvel and DC. In 1975, the first one, Superman versus the Amazing Spider-Man, is the groundbreaker there. And in 1982-83, DC published a 12-book miniseries called Camelot 3000, which they published without Comics Code Authority at all. Now, this one is a wonderful series. I would recommend it to anyone. It's available in a graphic novel. It addresses, among other things, non-heterosexual sex. If I recall, and it's been about 30 years since I've read it, the Tristan and Isolde characters, which of course are male and female in the traditional medieval narratives, are both female. This is why, the main reason why that series could not get its Comics Code Authority, but it sold really, really well. Then we come up to 1985. So we're entering the modern age, and this is the current age of comics history, and it's the one that concerns us because, of course, Watchmen is one of the early masterpieces in this period. It's typified by an increase in the darkness of the stories, but also by their psychological complexity. Comic books here stop being treated as children's literature and are more and more becoming literature. They're more and more becoming art. That is, they're still a product. They're still things that are making money. These are still being put out by DC and Marvel. There's a profit motive, and I've got no problem with that. But what the buying public seems to want, and what the artistic creators, both writers and artists, want to do, is basically not be doing Tiny Talent Time anymore. They want to do grown-up stories for people who have an interest in tackling complex issues. In 1986, DC puts out Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, which tells the story, and it's a very dark story by Frank Miller, it's brilliant, of the death of Batman when he comes out of retirement. It's just wonderful. And in 1986-87 is when we see the initial publication of Watchmen. That is, as with Dark Knight Returns and Camelot 3000, Watchmen was initially published as a miniseries of 12 discrete comic books. The first pages in each of the chapters of the graphic novel, those are the original covers of the initial issues. Neither The Dark Knight Returns nor Watchmen had the Comic Code Authority stamp on it, and I'm sure you can imagine, because you're far enough into Watchmen now, why. So what we also see in the modern age is the gradual abandonment of the Comics Code authority. Marvel was the first major publisher to just give them the boot, and that was in 2001. A line called Bongo Comics, which I've not really gotten into and never have really looked up. They dismissed them in 2010, DC in 2011, and Archie Comics, the very last one to drop it, also in 2011. So this is no longer part of comic book culture. And that basically is the history of the comic industry, to which we're going to refer a fair bit, because we'll see as we go through Watchmen, this history, as I said, is dramatized in both the main narrative and the interlude narratives. As for the book itself, I'd just like to say a few things before we move on to our chapter-by-chapter discussion. The story basically has two central what-ifs. The first what-if is, what if, after the publication of the first Superman comic, people actually started dressing up and going around fighting crime? These are the Minutemen, our first group of superheroes. Sorry, our first group of costumed heroes, because they're not really super, although some of them are really very interesting. The second what if is, what if a being with superpowers actually were to exist? This, of course, is Dr. Manhattan, and his narrative is central to the second group of costumed heroes, abortively named the Crime Busters by Captain Metropolis. Roughly, the Minutemen correspond pretty well to the Justice Society of America, and it looks like the Crime Busters are an anachronistic appeal to try to establish something like the Justice League, but it fails miserably. The common figure that holds these two together is, of course, the comedian who dies at the beginning of Chapter 1, and he's a fantastic character, and I don't mean that in a morally admiring way. I mean he's a brilliant piece of characterization. I'm not going to say too much about the individual characters in those two groups just now, because of course we'll be addressing them as we go through the text. But one thing I would like to point out is just the names. We never know Hooded Justice's name. He's the first masked vigilante, but there's a suspicion that he might be a fascist. The first Night Owl is Hollis Mason, a police officer. Silhouette is Ursula Zant, who is openly lesbian. Mothman is Byron Lewis, seems to be a socialist, or at least that's suggested. The comedian is Edward Morgan Blake, a war hero. Captain Metropolis is Nelson Gardner, an ex-Marine. The first Silk Spectre calls herself Sally Jupiter, although her real name is Jaspecic, and she's a model, and Dollar Bill is not named in the text. The names that they use, the names that we know, are largely fairly common, with the exception of Zant. These are fairly common white people names. These are Western European names, Anglo-Saxon names largely. These are the demographic from which the early superhero genre was drawn, and to whom it was really aimed. Well, okay, let's take a look at the second generation heroes. There's the second Night Owl, Night Owl 2, Dan Dryberg. Dryberg. That's a Jewish name. And he's an ornithologist. He has a weird kind of hobby. We'll talk about Dan later. I like him a lot. Silk Spectre 2 embraces her Polish identity. She doesn't go by Jupiter. She goes by Jaspecic, her actual name. The comedian, of course, Edward Morgan Blake. We'll talk more about him later. Ozymandias is Adrian Veidt. He is German, or rather, he has a German name. Rorschach is Walter Kovacs. Kovacs is a Slavic name. And then there's Dr. Manhattan, who is John Osterman. Osterman, the name means man of the East. Those are not the same kind of names that we see in the first generation. So there's a generational shift in the two groups of heroes that reflects the composition of the superhero community in actual published comics. So this is one of the ways in which the narrative tracks pretty well with the history of the comic book genre, of the hero comic genre. More on that later. This is just to get you curious. Now, as a result of those two what-ifs, we have an alternate history. So the book is set in 1985 in the United States. Watergate never happened. Watergate never happened because the United States won Vietnam. Nixon is still president. He's in his fourth term. So this ought to raise some questions. What about those two what-ifs? What if people dressed up in costumes to fight crime? And what if there were a real superpowered being on Earth? Which of those two ifs? How do those two what-ifs affect or relate to this history? Now, as this is a course in human nature and technology, I'm going to leave you with a couple of questions, and then we'll pick up with a specific discussion of Book 1. One, this is more of a literary question. What is the relationship between the traditional comic pages and the text pages at the end of each issue, the interludes? This is kind of interesting, and I want to explore that as we go. Also, what is the function of the pirate narrative that's embedded in the main narrative? This is also doing a very interesting job. The first edition of the graphic novel referred to Watchmen as the first postmodern comic book series in the world. Now, I can't remember the exact quotation or even the name of the writer of that particular introduction, which doesn't appear in subsequent editions because in 1988 I lent that particular version to my girlfriend at the time and never saw it again. Thank you very much, Bronwyn. But to get back on track, what types of technology are foregrounded? This is very much a book about technology. So think about that as we're going through. What technologies are there? How are they used? How do they relate to people, both physically and psychologically? How do they relate to society as a whole? Because, of course, the whole comic book superhero genre is very much bound up with technology. And it also puts a lot of pressure on the question of human nature, which Moore and Gibbons also do. So give some thought to that as we're working through, and hopefully we can actually talk about it during our live chat. For the time being, I guess the last thing I want to say is, for those of you who haven't read comics before, give the visual images their due. There's a tendency, I think this is especially true among people who have spent a lot of time with literature, with engaging themselves with words, to give words the primary place. And Gibbons here is as important as Moore. Make sure you read the images as well as the text, as well as the written text. There's interesting conversations going on between them, but also there's an interesting just visual narrative, or several interesting visual narratives embedded in the text. It's quite wonderful and quite engaging. So we'll be talking about some of that as we go through too. Another question, or another couple of questions, might be this. Why would a person choose to dress up in a costume and fight crime? What are the people like? What are the characters like that we see doing this? How do they relate to society, to themselves, to each other? They're a weird lot, and their psychological weirdness is deeply human, and I think really, really interesting. So yeah, why would somebody dress up in a costume and do that thing? So on that thought, or that question, I'm going to sign off for this module, edit and post, and get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks very much.